His boots crunched on the river stones, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the water. He froze. His rifle, heavy in his hands, slipped lower. It wasn't a threat that stopped him. It was a sound. Her laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant for anyone but her. But it cut through the air like a sliver of sunlight in a storm, a sound so brave it felt like defiance. She was kneeling by the water's edge, her skirts soaked, hands raw from scrubbing laundry on the flat, gray rocks. The town knew her as the widow, the one whose sorrow was a story whispered over fences and in the general store. But right then a splash of icy water hit her cheek, and her lips parted in a flash of pure, unthinking joy. In that instant she wasn't the town's tragedy. She was just a woman, desperately clinging to a reason to breathe. He knew he should have turned away, shouldered his rifle, vanished back into the trees, and continued his hunt. But he couldn't. His eyes locked on to a flicker of gold. She was pressing something into a bundle of wet cloth, her movements quick, furtive. It was a ring. He saw it glint just once, a tiny star of light before her hand closed over it, hiding it deep within the laundry as if she were ashamed. Ashamed that anyone might know she still wore it. His chest went tight. The shock of her laughter warred with the weight of that hidden secret. He'd heard the stories, heard the men in the saloon mutter her husband's name. They'd say she was too young to be left alone, too proud to ask for help, and too foolish to be caught laughing. Now here she was, water dripping from her chin, the last echo of that laugh fading as she suddenly felt it. The weight of his stare. Her head snapped up, her eyes meeting his across the rushing water. For a long moment, neither of them moved. His rifle hung useless at his side. Her hand was still pressed over the cloth, guarding her secret. The river was a chasm between them, a torrent carrying her hidden grief and his sudden sharp hesitation. Then other voices shattered the quiet. Two women, their steps heavy, their calls sharp with judgment as they walked down the bank. "Martha!" one of them called. The widow, Martha, flinched, her body tensing as she clutched the bundle of laundry to her chest. The cowboy melted back into the shadows of the trees, the darkness covering him once more. But the sound of her laugh clung to him. It was more dangerous than any bullet, more haunting than any ghost. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just witnessed the first crack in a heart that everyone believed was already buried. "Widows don't laugh by rivers," one of the women sneered, her voice like scraping metal. The words flew across the water and hit Martha harder than any stone. Her hand froze on the cloth she'd been rinsing, her shoulders going rigid. It was as if the river itself had betrayed her, carrying her moment of joy straight to her accusers. The second woman's voice was higher, laced with a cruel, mocking pity. "What would your poor husband think, seeing you splash around like some simple-minded girl?" Their laughter followed, a shallow, ugly sound that rippled over the water. It was nothing like the sound that had made the cowboy lower his rifle. He stayed perfectly still in the trees, a war raging inside him. Part of him wanted to step out, to let his presence be known, to silence them with a single hard look. But the raw sting in Martha's eyes told him this was a deeper wound, one that a stranger's interference couldn't mend. Martha hugged the laundry to her chest, her fingers digging into the wet fabric, right over the spot where the ring was hidden. She whispered something so quiet the women couldn't possibly have heard. But the cowboy did. "Better to laugh," she breathed, "than to drown." The words hung in the air, fragile as a prayer against the coming storm. The women were closer now, their skirts brushing against the tall reeds, their faces masks of self-righteous disgust. One of them pointed a bony finger at the riverbank, at Martha's bare feet resting on the cold stones. "Look at her," she said, loud enough for the whole valley to hear. "Not even a decent pair of shoes to her name, yet she dares to smile as if she were still a wife." Martha's throat worked, but no sound came out. Her hands began to shake, a slight tremor at first, then a violent shudder. The wet bundle of cloth slipped from her grasp, tumbling back into the current with a heavy splash. The ring almost came free. It flashed, a single spark of gold, before the waterlogged fabric folded over it again. The cowboy's breath caught in his chest. He knew the women hadn't seen it. But Martha knew, and pure animal panic flared in her eyes as she frantically scooped the bundle out of the water, clutching it like a lifeline. "Leave me," she finally said, her voice low but shaking with a desperate strength. The two women exchanged a look, a mixture of amusement and offense. The first one smirked. "Oh, we'll leave you, Martha, but the town doesn't forget so easily." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "A widow's laugh is louder than church bells. They'll all know by nightfall." With that final, venomous promise, they turned and walked away, their footsteps fading, leaving their poison to hang in the air like smoke. Martha sagged where she knelt, the fight draining out of her. Water dripped from her sleeves, from the ends of her hair. And for the first time since he'd been watching, the cowboy saw tears. She wasn't fighting laughter anymore. She was fighting to keep from breaking completely. He gripped his rifle, the steel cold and hard in his palm. A whisper escaped his own lips, a promise to the silent woods. "If they think joy is a sin," he muttered, "then maybe I'll be guilty too." She lifted her head, her senses on fire. She knew she wasn't alone. Her eyes, wide and hunted, darted toward the trees where he stood hidden. She saw the flicker of his shadow. Suspicion crossed her face, but something else was there too. An unspoken question. Had he heard? Had he heard everything? The river washed away the last echoes of their taunts, but the judgment remained, pressing down on her, heavier than the waterlogged clothes in her arms. She got to her feet slowly, her wet skirts clinging to her legs. The cowboy knew with a sudden sinking feeling that her secret wasn't safe. Not in a town this hungry for a scandal, and not with him, because he already held a piece of the truth in his hands. Her hands were trembling so badly she nearly dropped the bundle a second time. The spray from the river disguised the hot tears that finally broke free, tracing paths down her dust-streaked face. And when she turned, her escape blocked by the deep current, she saw him. He stepped out of the shadows. His rifle was slung low across his shoulder now, a deliberate gesture. He was not a threat. He was a presence. For a second, her instinct screamed at her to run, to protect the last tattered shred of her dignity. But his eyes weren't like the women's. They held no malice, no judgment. They held curiosity, pity, and something else, something much heavier she couldn't begin to name. He stopped a few paces away from her, his voice quiet but steady, carrying easily over the sound of the water. "Why do you hide your hand?" The question hit her like a physical blow, an arrow straight to the heart of her secret. He had seen it. He had seen the glint of gold she'd shoved so desperately into the folds of cloth. She hugged the bundle tighter, her lips parting, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of the river, a sound she wished could swallow her whole. Finally, she forced out a laugh. It was a brittle, ugly thing. "A widow has little use for jewelry," she said. But her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the lie. It wasn't vanity that made her hide it. It was a grief so deep it had become a part of her. He studied her face, his gaze so intense it felt like he was reading the story of her sorrow in the lines around her eyes. She hated him for it, hated that he could see so much. "Then why laugh?" he asked. He didn't ask it cruelly. He asked it like a man trying to solve a puzzle, like a man who couldn't understand why a single defiant flame would dare to burn in a place soaked through with rain. Her eyes snapped to his, a spark of fire in their depths. "Because if I don't laugh," she whispered, the words breaking apart as she spoke them, like the current crashing against the stones, I drown. For the first time since his shadow had fallen over her, she let him see the truth, raw and without disguise. That ring wasn't just a piece of metal. It was the last physical piece of the man she'd lost. A man whose blood had soaked into the dusty ground during a border raid, leaving her utterly alone in a town that measured her every breath, her every smile, against the cold silence of his grave. She dropped to her knees again, grabbing a piece of cloth and scrubbing it against a rock with a furious energy, as if the simple act of work could silence the memories. But the river blurred in front of her. Soon she couldn't tell the difference between the water and her tears. He didn't press her. He just shifted his weight, a man torn between stepping forward to offer comfort and leaving her to the privacy of her sorrow. She hated him for being there, for witnessing this moment of absolute weakness. And yet, a small, treacherous part of her clung to the fact that he had asked, not to condemn her, but because he seemed to understand. He understood what it meant to hold on to something that hurt too much to let go of. Still, she shook her head, forcing another fragile laugh that died before it ever really left her throat. "Go, cowboy," she whispered. "Let the river keep its secrets." But he didn't move. He just stood there, a silent sentinel against the fading light. And in that moment she felt a new kind of danger. Not the danger of judgment, but the danger of someone who might not let her drown in silence anymore. The dust of the market street was a choking, yellow cloud, kicked up by wagon wheels and the restless feet of shoppers. The air hummed with the noise of life, vendors shouting the price of flour, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle. It was a perfect mask for the whispers. But the whispers found their way through anyway. They sliced through the noise, sharp and venomous, and they all carried her name. She tried to be invisible. She moved through the stalls with her basket on her hip, her eyes fixed on the ground, trying to avoid the stares she could feel like a physical touch. But it was no use. The story had spread faster than a brush fire. The widow. She laughed at the river. By the time she reached the merchant's stall, a man she had once considered a friend of her husband, the weight of their judgment was suffocating. He leaned forward over a pile of potatoes, a greasy sneer spreading across his face. "Strange," he said, his voice loud, pitched for the benefit of the crowd. "Strange how a woman's grief can wash away so quickly in the river." A few men nearby chuckled. Some of the women smirked, hiding their satisfaction behind their hands. Martha's cheeks burned with a fire of pure humiliation, but she said nothing. She just gripped the handle of her basket, the wicker cutting into the soft flesh of her palm. She wanted to run, to turn and flee and never come back, but her feet felt like they were nailed to the ground, shame holding her captive. And then a new sound cut through the market chatter, the heavy, deliberate tread of boots. A broad shadow fell over her, breaking the circle of gawkers. The cowboy's voice rang out, calm and steady, and it silenced the sneers instantly. "Strange how a man's kindness dries up even quicker," he said. His gaze was locked on the merchant. It was a calm look, no anger in it, but it carried more weight than any threat. The market fell silent. The laughter died in people's throats. Martha's own breath caught a sharp, painful gasp as she realized he had followed her. Not just to watch, but to stand with her. The merchant sputtered, his hands twitching on the countertop, as if he wanted to argue. But the cowboy casually let his hand drift down, resting it near the top of his belt. There was no gun visible, but the message was clear. The promise of steel was there, waiting. "A man who mocks a woman for surviving," the cowboy continued, his voice still low, but every word hitting its mark, "ought to take a long look in the mirror before he calls himself whole." No one was laughing now. People started to turn away, suddenly interested in bolts of cloth or sacks of grain. Others just shuffled their feet, a flush of shame on their own faces. The silence he created gave her just enough space to breathe. She hated it. Hated that her relief was tied to him. Hated that she needed a defender at all. But her heart gave a painful lurch at the undeniable truth. His words had cracked the wall of cruelty she'd been standing against, all alone. The sting of it all was still too much. She grabbed a small sack of beans, paid for it with trembling hands, and turned to leave. As she passed him, she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, her voice tight with a confusing mix of gratitude and fury. "Don't follow me." She walked away, her skirts stirring the dust, not looking back. Every step was a battle between the urge to thank him and the urge to scream at him. But she could feel his eyes on her back, a steady, unwavering gaze, until the crowded street bent and swallowed her whole. "You shouldn't thank me." His voice came from the shadows of the narrow lane she'd ducked into, thinking she'd finally escaped him. The words landed on her like stones, heavy and cold, before she even had a chance to turn. She froze, her basket clutched to her chest like a shield. When she finally looked back, he was there, leaning against a brick wall, his rifle slung across his back. His eyes were shadowed, filled with something that unsettled her far more than the market's open mockery. "Why not?" she snapped, anger flaring to cover the tremor in her voice. "You silenced them. You stood up for me when no one else would. Isn't that what a hero does?" His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. Then he pushed himself off the wall and stepped closer. The truth, when it came, was a low, rasping whisper that tore her world apart. "Because I fought in the raid where your husband fell." The air left her lungs in a rush. The basket suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Her knees went weak, and she had to grip the handle with all her strength to keep from collapsing right there in the dusty alley. "You lie," she breathed, but it was a plea, not an accusation. She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception. She found none. His gaze was steady, unflinching, filled with a terrible honesty. "I was there," he said, and each word was a nail in the coffin of the life she thought she knew. Different uniform, different flag, but it was the same damn field, the same sun beating down on the same blood-soaked dust. I didn't know his name then, but I know it now. She wanted to scream, to throw her basket at him, to claw at his face, to somehow physically rip the confession out of him and make it untrue. Instead, her voice broke, shattering into 1,000 pieces. "So you come here to finish the job? To mock me? To laugh at the widow just like everyone else, but with a sharper knife?" He shook his head slowly, a flicker of profound pain crossing his face. It wasn't pity. It was something shared. "No," he said, his voice raw. "I came here to forget. But the sound of your laugh, it was the first thing that's broken through the silence I've carried since that day. I thought I left the war behind on that field, but I didn't. I carried it with me every single day. And when I heard you, when I saw you find a reason to smile, I realized I wasn't the only one still trapped in the grave of that field." Her hand flew to her chest, pressing hard against her hammering heart. The chill of the river seemed to rise up around her, even here in the stifling heat of the alley. Rage and sorrow and a terrifying, unwelcome flicker of understanding warred inside her. They twisted together until she couldn't tell which one was cutting her deeper. She wanted to hate him. She needed to hate him. It was the only thing that made sense. But she couldn't deny the raw, ragged truth in his confession. Still, her pride, her grief, her loyalty to the man he'd watched die, it all rose up in a protective wall. Her voice, when she finally found it, was fierce and cracked and shaking. "Then you'll never hear it again. My laughter died with him, and it dies again today with your truth." She spun around, her skirts flaring out, and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She wouldn't let him see the tears, but with every step the echo of his words followed her. She wanted to bury them, to pretend she'd never heard them, but she knew it was too late. They had already taken root in her heart, sharp and unforgiving. Like thorns, her grip on the basket went slack without her even realizing it. It tilted, then toppled, spilling the damp laundry and her few meager purchases across the dusty path. A single potato rolled into the gutter. Damn it, she cursed under her breath, dropping to her knees, scrambling to gather everything before more eyes could feast on her misfortune. But he was already there. He knelt opposite her, his large, calloused hands picking up the soiled cloth, with a gentleness that felt more disarming than his confession. "I don't need your help," she snapped, reaching to snatch a shirt from his hand, pride burning like a brand on her cheeks. But as she moved, her stomach lurched. A flash of gold. From the folds of a wet chemise, the ring slipped free. It tumbled through the air in a slow, perfect arc, catching the afternoon sun before landing half buried in the dirt between them. Her breath hitched. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. His eyes followed the glimmer instantly. For one stretched, eternal second, the entire world shrank to that one small object, the life she kept hidden, the bond she refused to break, the proof of a love that chained her even from beyond the grave. He didn't reach for it. He didn't move at all. His gaze just rested on it, heavy with a sad understanding that was somehow worse than judgment. It was the "I knew it" in his eyes that broke her. She snatched the ring up, her fingers closing around it, pressing it deep into her palm until the metal bit into her skin. "You've seen enough," she said, her voice sharp, but it couldn't hide the tremor of a soul laid bare. He didn't respond. He just finished placing the last of the damp clothes back into her basket, his silence screaming louder than any accusation. She shoved the ring deep into her pocket, her face flaming. But she couldn't escape the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a soldier or a stranger. It was a look of sorrow, a sorrow that seemed to mirror her own. "Why do you chain yourself to something that keeps you drowning?" he asked at last. His voice was quiet, but the words hit with the force of a physical blow. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the basket to her chest like a piece of armor. "Because it is all I have left," she hissed. The raw, broken truth of it hung in the air, so sharp it made even her flinch. He stood up too, dust clinging to the knees of his trousers. His rifle seemed forgotten on his back as he simply looked at her. Not as a soldier who had been on the opposing side, not as a man trying to be her savior, but as someone caught in the same trap, wrestling with his own ghosts. The ring in her pocket felt hot against her skin, a searing weight that would not let go. And as she turned to walk away, she knew his question would haunt her. It would follow her long after the town's cruel whispers had faded into the dust. Her fingers were clenched so tightly around the ring in her pocket that the sharp edges were cutting into her palm. The pain was a welcome distraction. It was a reminder that grief was real, that it had teeth, and that she had chosen to let it bite her every single day, because forgetting felt like a betrayal. Forgetting meant her husband died a second time. She ducked into the shadow of an abandoned freight wagon, leaning against the splintered wood, her chest heaving as if she'd just run for miles. She thought she was alone, but when she dared to look back down the alley, he was still there. He hadn't followed her closely. He was just standing there, a few dozen yards back, refusing to let her simply vanish. His eyes weren't on her face. They were on her hand, the one jammed deep in her pocket. And though he couldn't see the metal, she felt utterly exposed, as if the shape of her own fist was a confession. "Do you ever take it off?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded almost like a plea from a man who had been asking himself a similar question for a very long time. Her throat tightened. For a wild second she thought about lying, telling him it was just a trinket, something she wore out of habit. But the lie caught in her throat, choking her. "No," she whispered, the word harsh, her breath trembling. "Because if I laugh, If I smile, if I let go for even one single moment, it means I've betrayed him." The silence that followed was a living thing. It pressed in on her from all sides. Then he stepped closer, his face half hidden in the shadows of the wagon, and his reply cut deeper than any insult the town had ever thrown at her. "No," he said, his voice as firm and unyielding as granite. "It means you have survived him." He took another step. "Laughter doesn't dishonor the dead, Martha. It defies the grave that tried to swallow you whole." She flinched as if he'd struck her. The words shattered the careful walls she had built around her heart. And the tears came, the tears she had held back at the river, the tears she had choked down in the market. They came in a hot, furious flood, streaking down her face, a complete betrayal of the strength she pretended to have. She hated him for saying it. She hated him because a desperate, treacherous part of her wanted to believe him. The more she fought it, the harder her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird reminding her that she was still alive. And sometimes she desperately wished she wasn't. He reached out, his hand moving slowly as if to steady her. It paused in the air between them, an offer of comfort she hadn't asked for. She recoiled, stumbling back a step. Her hand in her pocket squeezed the ring, pressing it so hard into her flesh she knew it would leave an imprint that might never fade. "You don't understand," she choked out, her voice raw with a pain that was years old. But even as she said the words, she saw it in his eyes, the same torment, the same ghosts, the same haunted look of a man who also carried a battlefield inside him. The truth of that shared wound terrified her more than anything. She spun away from him, her skirts whipping around her ankles, and fled. She left him standing in the alley, his hand still suspended in the air. An unfinished gesture, a question that promised more than she was ready to accept. Dust hung in the evening air of the town square, thick and heavy. But heavier still were the whispers. They coiled through the crowd like smoke, finding their way into every ear, poisoning every conversation. The widow laughed. The cowboy, the stranger, defended her. She still carries her husband's ring, but hides her grief where no one can see it. The story grew with every telling, the truth bending and twisting until it was sharper and more dangerous than any simple fact. By the time she had to walk through the square again, her basket filled for the evening meal, the looks were no longer hidden. Faces turned openly, some with open mockery, some with a cloying, unwelcome pity, and a few, just a few, with a quiet, troubled curiosity. She could feel their eyes on her, crawling over her skin, judging every breath she took. Every flicker of her lips was examined, as if joy itself were a capital crime, and they were all part of the jury. A group of women by the public well stopped their chatter as she approached. They leaned their heads together, and one of them hissed, just loud enough to be heard, "Shameless, to laugh while her husband's body is still cold in the ground." But for the first time, not all the voices were against her. By the blacksmith's forge, an old man with soot on his face muttered to his neighbor, "She's just a girl. Let her live her life. The grave's got no right to chain the living." His comment earned him a sharp scoff from the woman next to him, but it was enough. It broke the solid wall of judgment. Suddenly, the square wasn't a unified court. It was a battlefield of murmurs, a town divided. She tried to keep her head down, her heart thundering in her ears, but she glanced up just for a second and saw him, the cowboy. He was standing at the far end of the street, by the saloon doors. His stance was casual, his rifle slung on his shoulder, but his eyes were locked on her. It was a gaze that dared the town to keep talking. His presence alone was enough to silence a few of the whispers, but for others it was like throwing fuel on the fire. They only hissed louder, emboldened by the drama of it all. A small child, no older than 5, darted past her, chasing a stray dog and giggling with delight. The pure, innocent sound sliced her heart in two. It was a brutal reminder of what her own laughter had cost her, and what it still meant to those who were free to feel it. The ring in her pocket burned like a hot coal against her palm. She squeezed it so tightly she half expected the gold to bend under the pressure. She wanted to scream, to stand in the middle of the square and scream that she had earned the right to one single moment of joy. That grief wasn't a performance, but her throat was locked tight, trapped by the fear of what would happen if she did. Instead, she turned sharply, heading down a narrow side street, her basket swaying. She had to escape before the whispers became shouts. Behind her, she saw the cowboy shift his weight, as if he was about to follow. But he stopped himself. He just stood there, watching her go, as still as a statue. He was a man who knew that every move he made could either be her shield or the thing that finally broke her. The air in the square pulsed with unspoken judgment, a town caught in a silent, bitter war. And she knew with a terrifying certainty the storm was only going to get worse. It would grow and grow until she either found the strength to face it or let it pull her under for good. "I should throw it where it belongs," she whispered, her voice fierce and shaking. Her hand trembled as she held it out over the rushing water. The gold band caught the last rays of the setting sun, glinting like a fallen star she no longer wished upon. She was back at the river, alone. Her skirts were damp, her hair stuck to her cheeks. The basket of laundry lay forgotten at her feet, a mundane chore from a life that felt like it was collapsing under the weight of this one single decision. The voices of the town were still with her. Every cruel word, every mocking glance echoed in her head. They had twisted her laughter into a sin, her joy into a shameful secret. She felt as if her very soul was on trial. Her fingers uncurled slightly. The ring balanced on the edge of her palm. The river beckoned. It promised silence. It promised release. It promised an end to the brutal war that was tearing her heart apart. "If I let you go," she murmured, her voice breaking, "he will be gone forever. But if I keep you, I'll never be free." The wind rustled through the reeds, seeming to carry her words away downstream, into the darkness. And then another voice, low, steady, and unyielding, cut through the twilight. "The river can't decide for you." She gasped and spun around. He was there, the cowboy. He was standing on the other side of the stones, his rifle slung low, as if he had risen from the earth itself. He was just watching her, his eyes holding no judgment, no demand. Only a deep, quiet endurance. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to leave her alone, to stop haunting these private moments of her grief. But her throat was raw, and no words came. Instead, she raised her hand higher, a defiant gesture, daring him to witness the choice she held in her palm. "Tell me then," she cried, her voice a ragged mess of rage and sorrow. "What do I do? Do I betray my husband with a laugh, or do I bury myself alive in silence?" His jaw was tight, a muscle clenching in his cheek. He didn't step any closer. His voice, when it came, was as solid as the stones beneath their feet. "You don't betray the dead by living, Martha. You betray yourself if you stop." The words hit her harder than any insult, harder than any blow, because they held no pity. They held no condescension. They held only the raw, undeniable echo of his own wound, the ghosts he carried from a battlefield she would never see. Her hand shook violently. The ring flashed one last time in the dying light. The river roared, louder now, as if it were hungry to claim it, hungry to strip her of the last piece of her past. She leaned forward, her world narrowing to just the dark, swirling water and a flood of memories. But then her eyes caught his, and in that silent, unwavering gaze, she saw the truth. The choice wasn't about the ring. It wasn't about the town. It was about her. She could cast it away and break, or hold on to it and remain chained. But either way, she knew with a terrifying clarity the decision could no longer be postponed. Her breath hitched, the simple act of inhaling a painful, shuddering effort. The weight of the ring in her palm felt immense, impossible. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. It felt as though grief itself, the terrible living creature she had housed in her chest for so long, was about to tear itself free. And in that moment of pure, terrifying clarity, she finally understood. What she held in her hand was not just gold. It was a shackle, polished by her tears, heavy with memories, binding her to a grave she had visited 1,000 times in the silence of her own mind. For so long she had told herself that to laugh was to betray him, that to smile was to trample on the memory of the love she had sworn to honor forever. But standing there, at the edge of the roaring river, with the cowboy's steady gaze holding her, she saw the truth. Her husband was gone, but she was not. And every day she chose silence, every day she choked back a smile, was another day she surrendered to death without ever lying down in the ground. Her fingers, which had been clenched in a fist, slowly, painfully loosened. She lifted the ring, but instead of casting it into the churning water, she turned. She walked toward him, tears streaming down her cheeks, but a fire of pure defiance burning in her eyes. His own breath caught in his throat when she reached him. She took his hand, and he flinched at the startling warmth of her touch against his own cold skin. She pressed the ring into his palm. Her voice was a ragged whisper, but it held the strength of a promise. "My laughter belongs to the living," she said, "not the dead. If you hear it again, it will be because of me, not in spite of him." His large hand closed over the small gold band. He wasn't claiming it. He was guarding it. And for the first time she saw the guilt in his face recede, replaced by a sense of release. It was as if her single act of courage had broken a chain that had been wrapped around his heart, too. The river roared behind them, a wild, cleansing sound, carrying away the last echoes of judgment and fear. She felt lighter, as if her soul, dragged down for so long by the current of grief, had finally found its way back to the shore. He reached out then. There was no hesitation this time. His hand found hers, his grip firm and steady, and she did not pull away. Instead, her lips parted, and a sound escaped. It startled them both. A laugh, soft, trembling, and fragile, but real. It spilled into the quiet evening air like the first notes of a song long forgotten. The world around them seemed to fall silent, pausing to hold the sacred, beautiful sound, and for a single perfect heartbeat, she felt her husband's memory not as a weight, but as a blessing, a whisper on the wind, urging her to live. The cowboy squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening in the twilight. And she knew. She knew the sorrow would always be a part of her story, but it would no longer be the whole story. She had chosen to carry her love forward, not as a prison, but as proof that she had survived. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of the human heart. Now, we have to ask you, if you were standing at that river holding that ring, what would you have done? Would you have cast it away or found a way to carry it forward? Let us know in the comments below.